and forge ahead. Really appreciate that everyone's taking the time to tune in tonight. Before anything else, I want to acknowledge that I'm here on the unceded country of the Yagara and Turrbal people. And while their sovereignty over this land remains unceded, this is stolen land. I live and I work and I do everything I do on this country on First Nations country. So I want to first, make it really clear how important it is that we address that and that we move, as quickly and comprehensively as we can towards, real truth telling, a frank recognition of the atrocities of our colonial past and towards treaty with First Nations people. This event is the first online Q&A type event we've done for quite a while now. I guess things have been a bit more normal of late, so we've been able to go back out and have the pop-up offices and that sort of thing. But it's still, you need nerves of steel to organise any bigger, more substantial event. So we thought we'd organise this online Q&A effectively because a few months ago we were expecting that by this point we would have had a final decision about the location of the new school for the Inner West. So this seemed like a sensible way to have a discussion with the community about that. We were expecting by the end of September that we'd have a decision, because that was what we were told in the last consultation report. But as it happens, we haven't heard anything yet. So since we'd put the time away for this event, I thought we might as well go ahead and we'll just have a very generic, non-school focused Q&A. And in the interim, while we wait for a final decision on the school, it's good to have these kinds of conversations, because I know lots of folks can't make it to the pop-up offices that we have generally during the week. So it's good to have something that's accessible for everyone. And it is one of those silver linings coming out of a year and a half of pandemic that we're all much more used to having events and forums like this online. Now, we have got some questions in advance, so thanks to those folks who have been in touch with the office to put their questions. But please keep them coming. We've got about an hour for answering questions, give or take. So please keep the questions coming. And when you put your question in the comments, please just include a bit of info about yourself, where you're from, basically, just so that we can kind of tie ourselves to a place. I think it's always nice to be able to relate to people and where they're from, where they are. Now, before jumping into the Q&A, as I ordinarily do with these things, I did want to just take a moment to kind of go over some of the general state of play around the state, and also some of the work that we're doing here in the Maywar electorate office. I guess the big thing that we can't look away from at the moment is obviously the state of play with COVID, and the fact that the state government's recently announced its roadmap to reopening the borders. This is a huge step. It was always going to be one of the most difficult political and policy decisions to make. Obviously tough calls to be made at the outset and getting the health response right, but how we emerge from that is in some ways even more complex. So we've been fielding more emails and calls than I could count from distressed locals who are stuck interstate, especially when the borders just snapped shut a couple of months back, or a few months perhaps it was. So look, in that context, I'm really glad to see that the state has started a home quarantine trial. Now, this is something that we've been thinking about and talking about for a long while, but it's obviously a big call, to given that we've had some, breaches of hotel quarantine even. It's a tough one to manage in some ways, but I'm really glad that that's going ahead, as other states have done. I think we obviously need to find a way for home quarantine as long as we're going to keep quarantine as a feature of our border control here. We need to find a way to do it, more accessibly for everyone, which leads to one of my main concerns about this plan, is that we're still left with this situation where folks will either need to go into hotel quarantine, which is pretty crazy expensive. It's over more than a few $1,000 for an individual, especially in the given that home quarantine is almost free. I've got some concerns as well about the way that home quarantine again can potentially only be available to folks who have standalone freestanding property that they can quarantine in themselves, or family members who can take time off work. So look, there's no such thing as an ideal solution here, I suppose, but I do really worry about the way that these measures and these health responses can further disadvantage people who are already struggling. Or maybe the flip side of that is that they really do work for folks who have the means to either pay for hotel quarantine or who can afford a living arrangement that affords them more space. I'm a little concerned as well about the ongoing restrictions around coming back into the state by car. So for that period between 70 and 80% vaccination, you'll be allowed to fly back into the state, but you can't drive over the border. So look, that's another issue where it's obviously a bit more complex and probably costly to allow for people to return to Queensland by car. But I think those are the sorts of challenges that the state government should be taking on, so that as many Queenslanders as possible can get back home and get home for Christmas even. I guess just to round out the COVID conversation, I can't emphasize enough how important it is that everyone gets vaccinated. We have been lagging behind a bit in terms of our state's performance relative to the other states, and obviously internationally we've been a long way off the pace for quite a while now. So I can't emphasize enough that we do need to all go out and get vaccinated. If you know loved ones, if you've got friends or family wherever they might be around the state who aren't vaccinated, please encourage them to go and do so. It's not difficult. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of time anymore. So we need to get those numbers up as quickly as we can. It really is going to be just essential to our state's health and well-being, and the way we deal with the inevitable incursion of COVID into our communities. It is going to happen, and we're going to see real strain on our health system, and the extent of that strain, the pressure that's put on all of those health workers across the state, is going to directly depend on how comprehensive our vaccination is across the state. So there are a couple of ways we can approach that. And the first, obviously, is to get vaccinated. And the second is to spend what's required to properly fund our hospitals, to increase the number of ICU beds and the like that we have. Now, anyone who's paying attention last week might have noticed that my good friend and colleague, Amy McMahon, introduced a private member's bill, to create a state-based big bank levy. So it's a very modest levy on the big four banks plus Macquarie. So only the five biggest banks operating in Queensland, which would raise just over $1 billion each and every year, which, that would make a huge difference to our struggling health system. It wouldn't fix everything by any stretch of the imagination, because we are, there's a lot more we need to be spending to have world-class healthcare for Queenslanders. But it would be, we're talking a drop in the ocean in terms of the big profits that the big banks are raking in. Their half-year cash profits across those big banks increased by an average of 62% throughout the pandemic. So we think there's no reason why they can't give a little bit more to make sure that we've got the resourcing we need in our hospitals when we face the inevitable surge in COVID cases when we open up. So look, I'll leave that there for a moment. As I said, pop the questions in if you want to ask about anything COVID related. But look, a few other issues that are on our radar around the state at the moment, statewide issues. There was some renters' rights reform recently. If you're following our Greens pages, you would have seen a bit about that. Labor's bill passed Queensland Parliament recently. It certainly had some good aspects. It made improvements, particularly around the capacity, the ability for people facing DV to get out of their place when they need to. And also it created some minimum standards. But what we didn't see out of that bill was the kind of fundamental shift in that power imbalance between landlords and renters that we really need. The government claims to have put an end to no ground evictions, and it blows my mind that we got to the end of of a week's debate on this bill, and they were still saying that with a straight face, because there is nothing stopping any landlord from turfing a tenant out for no reason whatsoever, just at the end of the lease, at the end of a fixed term lease period. They don't need a reason, you're just out, which means that those other improvements around, say, for example, the slight changes they've made around renting with pets or minimum standards, people are still going to be reluctant when they're renting to enforce those, because they can, at the whim of their landlord, be turfed out at the end of that fixed term period. So, look, it's not an entirely bad outcome. As I said, a couple of minor improvements, but it just doesn't go anywhere near addressing the real issues that are at the core of this. What we do need to see is a genuine end to no grounds evictions, and a necessary kind of counterpoint to that is a way to prevent rents just going through the roof as a way of, by default, evicting someone who can't afford to pay those rents. Look, I recently was just over a month ago now, I introduced a bill that would raise the age of criminal responsibility in Queensland to 14. Now, at the moment in Queensland and around the country, kids as young as 10 can be locked up, which I think is a shocking indictment. It's out of step. It's out of step with our human rights obligations, and it's clearly just not working. The current youth justice system isn't working. There's no real debate about that, no matter which side of the debate you fall on, whether you want the chest beating tough on crime rubbish, or if you want to see a more compassionate human rights based approach to these issues. Everyone agrees that the system's broken. So anyway, I'll pop a link in the comments at the end, because we're at the moment, until the end of this month, you can make a submission on that bill. So we're really, really keen to get as much support in those submissions to the Community Support and Services Committee as we can. So I'll pop a link at the bottom that gives you some basic instructions on how to contribute to that. Look, I can't skip over this intro bit without touching on climate change and the state of play at the moment. I'm sure it's on everyone's minds this week, particularly given that the COP26 conference is happening right now in Glasgow. This is one of those truly, I can't overstate how important this moment is in terms of getting our international response right. And it's been absolutely shameful, really embarrassing to see the way that, ScoMo's put together this pamphlet of a plan before going. We are an international embarrassment in terms of our climate response. And I honestly, like, that guy has come out with some crackers in his time, but I can't believe that he, with a straight face, was willing to put out this plan that says in bold typeface, this doesn't change any policies. There will be no change to policy or legislation. It's absolutely business as usual, and it's bloody embarrassing. But look, at the state level, as a state MP, I've been working hard in Queensland Parliament to call out both of the major parties on their continued hypocrisy on climate. We've seen the Labor Party in Queensland, of all of those states that have an emissions reduction target, ours is the worst. It's a bit embarrassing. We're being completely outclassed by the Liberals and Nationals in New South Wales. We just need to be more ambitious here in Queensland, given that we, as the state that's most susceptible to natural disasters, we need to be more ambitious. We need to be leading this conversation rather than, paying lip service to it and relying on industry to do all the heavy lifting. And of course, we need to reach a point where we stop opening up new coal mines and gas fields. It couldn't be clearer. The science is absolutely clear that's got to end. There's no space for any new fossil fuel developments if we're going to keep within that 1.5 degrees of average global warming. So, look, just one quick local issue I'll mention before we jump into questions. There's been a bit of action around St Lucia recently with the St Lucia Community Association pushing for a proactive review of the vegetation in the suburb in an attempt to better protect that. because we've obviously got this ongoing issue where the planning system prioritises the interests of developers over the local environment and the community's needs and concerns. So I was really impressed to see SLCA, push ahead and take that issue directly to council. And it's unfortunate that council's basically said, no, they're not going to do it. They don't have the resources to do it, despite the fact that, as I understand it, they are carrying out a similar sort of review around the development of a neighbourhood plan in other Southside suburbs. But anyway, look, it's a shame that we haven't seen council jump on board with that, but hats off to St Lucia Community Association for their work. Okay, well, that was a long, rambling intro. Only 17 minutes into the Q&A without taking a single Q or giving an A. But I'll jump straight in. So there's a comment from Daniel on Facebook. It says, with property prices making home ownership so inaccessible, renters' rights are more important now than ever. Could not agree. Look, it's just impossible for a lot of people to conceive of being homeowners these days. So it's more and more the case that renting will be a lifelong reality for folks. So this is why it's so important that fundamental power imbalance is dealt with. And as we all the talk at the moment about the white hot property market just drives home the point that we've got to get that right. We've got to stop treating housing as a commodity and a means of generating wealth for individuals, and recognise that it's actually just about making sure that everyday people have a safe, secure, stable place to live. Okay, question from Callan on Facebook about the Olympics. Callan asks, the Queensland government has been saying this will be the first climate positive Olympics ever, which as far as we can tell doesn't mean anything. It's an empty talking point. If they wanted to make the Olympics a real turning point, Queensland Labor could pick up on our plan for 100% clean energy. Now, I guess what this really comes down to is that, there's going to be a lot of talk about the Olympics. It's there's a lot of hype around this, and there's going to continue to be, a whole bunch of kind of parochial, love in on the fact that we're going to be an Olympics host. But ultimately, we actually need the government to really, focus in on the granular impacts that this is going to have on our communities. I'm sorry, look, I've just noticed the question that I actually skipped over is, what's the climate impact of the Olympics? So yes, good one. Sorry, Callan. This is me not driving the tech very well. So look, all the spruiking of the climate positive Olympics doesn't really mean very much if we're not seeing genuine action on the rest of the climate crisis. And I think just to tie back into the other comments and the discussion about renting, I've got real concerns about the impacts of the Olympics on housing affordability. So aside from the hollow talking points about climate positive, there's no answers to the questions that we've been asking about how it's going to affect the local community, particularly around, if you look at areas like the Gabba, where there's going to be obviously a massive impact on on the suburb as a general rule, but also specifically on housing affordability, because the amount of accommodation that they're going to want to put in there for tourists, as well as for who knows where we're going to house all of the Olympians. But look, in terms of the environmental impacts of this proposal overall are going to be quite enormous. Like, I'm very concerned about that. It does present an opportunity for us to get some much needed infrastructure in the inner city. And so, pivoting from looking at the concerns to finding ways to make this actually work better for Brisbane and for the southeast corner, we need to make sure it doesn't turn into an excuse just to endlessly build new roads. So we haven't seen real agreement yet between the state and federal governments about the transport infrastructure that they're going to build, but I'm really keen to see much more spend on public transport. So we're talking about more buses more often, more trains and more train lines. Obviously, there's great potential for the Cross River Rail to change the way that the whole transport system works together. And I'm still going to keep banging on about the potential to reopen the Tennyson train line. Now, as it happens, like that's been closed down for some years now, but it will run right past the Olympic tennis venue at Tennyson. So opportunities like this, I think we've really got to kind of pick those up and run with them. But that's not going to happen unless we see the government really turn its focus to what's in the best interest of the community and not just get carried away with the Olympics hype. Right. Next question. Look, thanks for the question, Callan. I hope that goes some way to answering it. But yeah, look, climate and the Olympics. It's a bit of an ugly scenario in some respects, I think. It haven't gone anywhere near touching on the amount of air traffic that it'll generate getting people in and around the world for this kind of spectacle. But, okay, next question is from Ahmed on the Indooroopilly cluster. Ahmed asks, it's been a few months now since we had the large COVID outbreak on the west side. What do you think we can learn from it? Great question. It was, it doesn't feel like, it's one of those things that feels like it was just the other day, but also ages ago. And like politics moves very quickly, so it's important to kind of take a moment to pause and reflect on what we can learn from occurrences like this. And it's, my staff really, I've got to take a moment to just thank the staff that really, they busted the gut. Everyone in this office worked really hard to support the community in every way we could. And we have taken, pause and taken stock to reflect on, what worked, what didn't work. It was a really pretty harrowing experience for those thousands of families around the electorate who were directed to quarantine, and especially in those, couple of schools, in Indooroopilly and Ironside in particular, where effectively the entire school community went into quarantine. And I think, again, not just my staff, but those school families, the entire community, the school administration, the way everyone dealt with it was quite spectacular. And I think, the way that the community pulled through and that we got through that outbreak, it really did have the potential to put us into a much wider, much more long-term lockdown. And the fact that we pulled through it as well as we did, I think it's something we should all be really, really proud of. So it was obviously, a quick, strong government response, as much of the rest of the health response has been. That kind of got us through it, as well as the work of all of those health workers, public servants who kind of, helped guide us through it. But we also saw the kind of hard limits of the government's health and economic response. So, some of the really tangible examples of that were that there were as far as I can read it, thousands of families who didn't get their formal quarantine directions. So, while the messaging was pretty clear cut and, people were able to, they knew more or less what they had to do or could source that information, it did mean that folks who were quarantining weren't able to apply for some of the government supports that were available, the financial supports. We did hear from quite a few people that the testing capacity, with that many people needing to get tested and doing it on a synchronized quarantine timeline, it just meant that there wasn't the capacity we needed at those crunch points along the way. So even with the testing sites that popped up over at the Altawong Bowls Club and at Indooroopilly High, people were waiting for excruciatingly long times in cars with kids, young kids in many cases. The information about those testing sites wasn't always up to date as well, at what times they would be open and closed, and people lining up for hours and then being turned away before they could get tested. So, you know, having enough testing capacity was a really big issue, and something that I think, you know, hopefully we're nearly beyond the point now of having that same sort of fear of outbreaks. But we certainly need more testing capacity at times like that. A similar issue alongside the failure to issue quarantine directions was that there was a lot of confusion at the end about whether or not a release letter would be necessary before families could get out of quarantine. And I think some of that confusion just came from a few, you know, a few unexpected words from the Premier at a press conference. So, look, again, this is, I guess I'm not trying to say that any of this stuff is easy or that we can expect it to be perfect, especially when we see a, you know, quarantine on that scale just kind of erupt overnight. But it's the kind of really important part of our government's response that does warrant scrutiny. So I've spoken about this in Parliament before. I've been, you know, pushing for an increase in our contact tracing capacity as well, particularly, you know, given the inevitable increase in the number of cases as we open up, and also the way that the modelling that we're relying on does anticipate that there'll be, you know, that we'll continue to use those important parts of the health response. So, you know, quarantining and tracing and testing, we need to maintain that capacity. And yeah, contact tracing is an important part of that. So, yeah, so look, given that, you know, our system struggled a bit when we got to the point of, you know, 20-ish cases a day, and we're expecting that number to jump to, you know, many hundreds of cases a day, depending on what modelling you look at. We need more contact tracers, and we need them fast. So, look, I mean, there was a lot to take away from the Indooroopilly cluster, but I guess they're probably the top points that I would refer back to. So, thanks for the question, Ahmed. Moving on, we've got another comment on Facebook from Mike. Also on the Olympics, I'm mostly concerned about the destruction of our local heritage, i.e. East Brisbane State School, the debt burden being passed to the taxpayer, and the RTI exemption. So Joe would be proud, I think. Yeah, it's a little bit sharp. Touch a raw nerve there with some of the government members, I'm sure. But look, I mean, I couldn't agree more, especially in terms of sites like East Brisbane State School. I know that Amy's been trying to follow this as closely as she can, and we're both, you know, genuinely concerned about how the Olympics could, could impact on Queenslanders in a variety of ways as well. Where are we? Okay, so look, one other point that I did want to raise. I've been hearing quite a bit from local residents about Clive Palmer's proposal to build a power station, a new coal-fired power station out in the Galilee Basin, which is kind of a crazy idea. But I wanted to, give a bit of an update while we get some more questions coming through. But look, for those who don't know this context, it's a proposal that Clive put forward some years ago now, because he, as you might be aware, he's one of the proponents of these brand new thermal coal mines in the Galilee Basin. And alongside that, he included a proposal to build a coal-fired power station that would, among other things, be the source of power for the coal mines. So it's this absolutely insane approach of using coal to power the extraction of more coal in an era when we need no new coal. But it's insane, and letting it go ahead would be an absolute disaster for our climate. What we do know, though, is that the state government does have power to step in on this. It's a really unusual approval situation where the local government is actually going to hold on to approval power. So the power to approve sits with local government because it's being assessed under a planning scheme, which again is a very strange situation. It's a bit of a historical anomaly. And it's kind of nuts to see Clive, trying to hide this approval for a multi-billion-dollar coal-fired power station, by sending the application to a tiny little council. But anyway, we know that the Deputy Premier, who is also the Planning Minister, Stephen Miles, does have power to stop this thing by calling in the project under the Planning Act. So there's, without getting into the detail, there's clearly a state interest here, which means he's got scope to call it in. And if you properly assess the impacts of a new coal-fired power station at this point in history, it's clear that they've got the power, in my humble opinion, that they've got the power to say this thing shouldn't go ahead. This is a time when we should be investing in secure jobs, and whether it's in health, education, construction, and clean energy. A coal-fired power station is absolute madness. I've written to the Planning Minister to put my position on this. It would be great if anyone who's paying attention tonight wanted to get in touch with Minister Miles about this as well. That's another one. I'll pop some comments in, pop some links in the comments at the end of the stream. Okay, next question. Question from Mike on Facebook. What are the Queensland Greens' plans to better represent the regions and pull votes away from parties like the LNP Nationals, who no longer represent their interests? Given there is so much alignment between Greens policy and concerns of regional people, why is there still such a gap there, and how is it being addressed? Oh, great question. It's interesting to think about the role of the Nats and the kind of outsized sway that they have in the national policy debate. That's been really brought into sharp focus with all this bollocks about net zero by 2050 and their new pamphlet plan that the federal coalition's put together. The Nats get about 5% of the national vote, whereas the Greens are getting twice that routinely. So the mind boggles a little bit to think that they can, that they can pull strings in the way that they have recently. Look, obviously you'd be aware that in Queensland we don't have that, discrete Liberal and National Party division anymore. It's the LNP, and like many of you would be aware that the seat I hold before I won it, it's an inner city seat. It was a new seat in the 2017 election, but it was notionally an LNP seat. So, that's not quite what you're asking, I know, but I guess it's, it does demonstrate that there's definitely scope for the Greens to start moving in on LNP seats and to increase like the margin, as we did in the 2020 election just gone. We increased the margin here in Maywa with something like a 14% increase in primary vote. So I guess the political reality is that the dial on electoral outcomes, you can't go from 2 to 10 in one election, and so to win regional seats is something that requires a lot of work, and it's important that we're honest about that as a party. But ultimately, it is those votes from across the entire state that saw Larissa Waters elected to the Senate, in 2010, and then again just at the last federal election for another full term. And this time round, a lot of the analysis tells us that we are in a contest for that last Senate spot. It's a race between us and Pauline Hanson. So I think that really is a challenge for us, because a lot of those disaffected, abandoned Nationals voters are the people who are perhaps most susceptible to going to One Nation, especially. I mean, it's not just those folks, but look, I think I've seen a few different comments, and don't read the comment section. It doesn't pay off as a general rule, but people who are furious about the Feds even taking on a net zero by 2050 target. Sure, there are going to be some people who look somewhere else, and they're not our people. But in terms of really getting on side with folks in the country, it's as much as in the regions. I mean, it's as much a challenge of just continuing to build our movement and, demonstrating, and there's a lot of legwork to be done just for the party in the regions. And that's hard yakka for a party like ours that doesn't take the big corporate donations, that doesn't have the, the deep pockets to just throw money around the state. But look, I'll just bring us back to the federal election that's coming up, and the fact that we've got this extraordinary chance this time round to get a second Green senator in Queensland. And our top candidate on the Senate ticket this time, Penny Allman-Payne, is an absolute cracking candidate. She's genuinely one of the best people I know. She's really, she's a teacher, has worked as a lawyer in the past, a unionist. She's one of the most staunch advocates you could possibly have standing in your corner. And she's from the regions. Penny's lived all over the state at various times, grew up in remote far north Queensland, but she's been living in Gladstone for the last, however many years. So I'm really, really excited about the prospect of having a Greens senator, representing our state, but coming from the regions in Queensland. So I think that kind of showing could go a long way to kind of breaking down some of those misapprehensions about the party. Okay, again, a fairly long-ish, rambly-ish answer. But look, I'll go on to the next question. It's from Steve from Indooroopilly on youth crime. Hi, Michael. I've heard that youth crime has been going up in our local area. What do you think is the solution to this? Appreciate the question, Steve. It's not the first time I've talked about this sort of issue on one of these forums, because it's almost inevitable that at some point in the cycle we're going to see folks trying to make political mileage out of crime, because crime sucks for the people who fall victim to it. But the reality is that we do have very low crime rates, here in Brisbane, across the state, really. If you look at there are some QPS crime maps online where you can track back over time, over a period of the last 3 months, 6 months, back to 5 years ago, levels of crime and different classifications of crime. And the truth of it is that crime rates have remained pretty steady over the last 5 years around the whole area that I represent. Now, there was, as I understand it, earlier this year, there was some isolated clusters of car break-ins, like people breaking into cars, and some car theft. There were some home invasions, and I know some people would be aware of a violent invasion that happened in St. Lucia, and that's shocking that that anyone could be hurt in their own home. But that is absolutely the exception, not the rule. What we've seen is that there's been some misreporting and some entirely inaccurate commentary about this on social media, kind of conflating incidents that happened all across the west side, right out to Capera and or even far northern suburbs. So look, that does create a heightened awareness, obviously. When we've got people kind of spruiking a crime wave of sorts. But ultimately, what we really need to focus on is the sensible suggestions from police. Make sure you lock your car and your house overnight. But the data genuinely don't suggest that there's any really major cause for alarm here in the inner west at the moment. So, take sensible steps. To look after your stuff and yourself. Now, any crime obviously is not what we want to see, but I think rather than doubling down on the kind of punitive carceral response that we've traditionally seen from governments, I think what we need to take from this and from the reports about crime waves and in whether it's in Townsville or Mount Isa or elsewhere in North Queensland, we need to recognise that the youth justice system isn't working, which harks back to the discussion earlier about alternative approaches, and rather than locking up kids who are behaving badly, we need to start addressing those root causes of crime. When we take those young kids and lock them up, the data, like, the stats are crystal clear that the earlier a kid comes in contact with the criminal legal system, the more likely they are to reoffend. And so that's why we can't afford to be locking up kids as young as 10. We know that kids' brains at that age haven't developed to the point where they've got impulse control and the ability to properly comprehend consequences. So locking them up doesn't work. It in fact just makes them more likely to reoffend. So we've been pushing hard to see the government, first of all, raise the age, but alongside of that, we need to see an alternative evidence-based approach to youth crime that focuses on prevention and early intervention, and therapeutic responses, because so many of this cohort of kids, some of the statistics are extraordinary. I don't have them off the top of my head, but the amount of the proportion of these kids who have some kind of cognitive impairment, and that's before you start talking about the broader trauma that sits in the background for a lot of these kids, the fact that they don't have safe housing, stable accommodation, school attendance is difficult for a lot of them. So anyway, we just need to recognise that what we're doing is not working and shift our focus to actually meeting the needs of children. And we'll save a bucket load of money over time. It costs over $1,600 per day to detain a child. So why we wouldn't choose to invest that in actually providing these kids with what they need, it absolutely boggles my mind. But anyway, I hope that gives you some some comfort and consolation, Steve. If you're interested to go and pick apart those numbers, you can just look up, if you just Google QPS crime maps, you'll find it relatively easily. And it's a fascinating exercise to debunk a lot of the talk about local crime sprees. All right, next question. Question from Aiden. Aiden, g'day. Has asked any updates from the Lord Mayor about the Mount Cootha shuttle bus. Look, unfortunately, no. We haven't heard anything from the Lord Mayor. For those who aren't in the know or as glued to transport issues as Aiden is, Council recently decided that they were going to scrap the Mount Cootha shuttle bus, which I find kind of shocking, to be honest, that we would choose to cut public transport, especially public transport to an iconic site like Mount Cootha, rather than actually pausing, zooming out a bit and considering, why is it? If they've obviously decided that not enough people were using the bus, so why not? And the truth of it, I think, is that it didn't, we just don't have the kind of connectivity within our public transport system to make that bus useful to as many people as you could. So I recently actually had a meeting with folks from the Department of Transport, from TransLink in particular, who are responsible for funding buses, making decisions about funding and timetabling across the state. And I know that right at the moment, Council and the state government are working on a full network review. So look, I'll be pushing really hard to make sure that the new bus network does include high frequency routes all over the west side. And we've identified plenty of these gaps before, those kind of, intersuburban links that just don't exist but need to make it more functional. So, for example, linking up Toowong and Barton, you shouldn't have to go in and out again to just make that simple trip on public transport. So, in addition to those, those links and high frequency routes, I'm really keen to see a route reinitiated from Toowong, through to Barton and to Mount Cootha. Okay, question from Daniel on Facebook. A lot of people agree with the Greens' actual policies, but are turned off, rightly or wrongly, by the Greens brand, probably because of years of attacks from mainstream media and major parties. Are the Greens aware of how they are perceived by a large portion of the electorate, and has there been much discussion into trying to fix this? Good question. Look, I think you're right on the money that there are some really, probably widely held and pretty wild misconceptions about the Greens across Queensland. And look, this isn't news to me. I've heard maybe just about all of them over the last few years of being an MP and as a candidate before that. Look, the challenge for us, again, I think comes back to the fact that we're, we don't take corporate donations and, we don't play to the demands of the Murdoch media. So we do, we're just used to receiving bad press. That kind of comes with the territory. And honestly, that's no accident. I mean, when a political party like ours actively challenges and pushes up against existing power structures, be they the old two-party system of government or the fossil fuel interests that seem to be just in lockstep with with Murdoch and aside from their road to Damascus moment recently, their support for renewables, but they're hooked in with interests that we're actively challenging, that we want to change those existing power structures in ways that they don't agree with. So I guess in some ways, some saying from someone somewhere, don't judge me by the friends I've made, but by the enemies I've made, or something along those lines. And look, during the last election campaign, when we had the Queensland Resource Council come out swinging and kind of break itself a little bit over being so hyper partisan against the Greens, that's the kind of fight that I'm willing to pick any day of the week. And to be honest, I think that actually a lot of people can relate to that. A lot of people can kind of, when they see that conflict, it doesn't necessarily turn everyone off. But anyway, back to the question. Yes, a lot of misconceptions. Maybe that kind of media doesn't disavow people of those misunderstandings. So the best way, in my experience, that we can kind of cut through that and counter the kind of baseless narratives about the party is to have one-on-one conversations, and certainly that's something that that I have found myself, both just as a regular person and member of the party before I was elected and as an MP. But I've seen it through the campaigns, the field campaigns that we've run. There's incredible power in door knocking and just bringing politics to people, where they live, putting a face on politics, because people are, I think, quite fairly disengaged from politics. I mean, I don't think that's the right way to approach it, because any kind of acquiescence to the status quo is just obviously you're not going to change anything that way. But yeah, taking our policies and our politics to people at the door, we can kind of demonstrate to people that they're logical, that they make sense, that they're based in evidence, and that they're focused on helping the community. And when you're able to communicate that message to people one-on-one, that's far more powerful, and it has a lasting impression that you'll never achieve through a Courier Mail hit piece. So yeah, look, it's maybe we can't have a one-on-one conversation with every person in the state at this point, but that's absolutely the most effective way to break that down. And look, and as we get more MPs elected across the state and across the country, that will just simply mean by default that more people will interact with us as elected reps and with the Greens as a party, and realise that we're that none of the stereotypes actually count for anything, and that those parts of our policy and our approach that the media like to beat up on are actually a strength of the party, because we do need change. We need deep structural change. So obviously the climate crisis is the most glaring example of that, where we simply cannot afford to keep doing things the way that we have done. And I think climate, more than any other issue, shows just how deep the structural change needs to be. So look, I appreciate that question, and I hope the answer's given you some insight into how we're approaching that. But the short answer is we we can't control the way mainstream media chooses to report on us. It's never going to be, while we are trying to pull apart the system that they're so dependent on retaining, that's not going to change anytime soon. So if anyone who's interested in participating in that project, there's plenty of campaigning going on at the moment in the context of the federal election. So contact your branch, sign up, get involved in some door knocking or some market stalls, or however you can with the campaigns that are on foot. Next question. All right, we're down to 10 minutes now, so I'll get through a couple more if I can before I wrap up. Next question is from Lucid Tech on Facebook. Is the Toowong West End Green Bridge still going ahead despite the funding issues from earlier this year? Yeah, look, really happy to say that, yes, absolutely. As far as I know, the Green Bridge, all of the Green Bridges, well, I'll speak to the two in my electorate because there's one further out that the government's, the council squibbed on. But the Toowong to West End and St Lucia to West End Green Bridges, as I understand it, are still going ahead, and the Toowong West End is council's priority at the moment. And I'm absolutely chuffed about both of these projects, and there's some of the fine details that really do need to be worked through with both of them. But we campaigned on this for years about the need for new green bridges and better active transport infrastructure around the city. So it's great to see that that council's on board with that and that they've committed. We haven't seen funding committed for it yet, so council's not budgeted for even much beyond pre-feasibility. Like, there's no detailed design studies that have been budgeted for yet, even less construction costs for any other than the Kangaroo Point Bridge, I think. I'm sorry, they've got detailed designs on the Brecky Creek Bridge now as well. But I think what the question's referring to, and it was a bit disappointing seeing this, was there's no state funding for them yet. And I don't know who put it to the Treasurer exactly, but he, in a quite, churlish way, just immediately said, no, the state's not going to fund any of that. It's council. It's a council project. Well, that's bollocks, frankly. I mean, these are the kinds of, huge, very important, city-making bits of infrastructure that the state really should be investing in. So I'll keep pressure on the state about that. So what we know now, and importantly, I'll focus on the Toowong Bridge for a moment, but it's going to be landing at the former ABC site, which is a fantastic outcome. It's certainly the most sensible outcome, I think, in terms of the alignment options that they considered. But I've been leading a campaign for years, and it went on for years before I was elected, but we've been working so hard to get that land purchased back for a riverside park. It's the last opportunity for a public riverside space in the inner west. And so we know, obviously, with the bridge landing there, that there's going to be some public space associated with that. The rest of the site, though, in fact, the entire site, we know they're going to have to buy some of it back, but the site's owned by a developer, and they are sadly progressing with plans to build apartments on part of it. But it does seem clear that after all those years of pushing, we will actually see Green Bridge landing on this site in the next little while. And to be honest, I've not yet given up hope of the possibility that that council could see the light and buy back the remainder of that site. There's a really interesting link here as well to the new school, which, as I said, we're still waiting on a decision there, but council's been clear that they can't go ahead with the use of the Gailey Road precinct, as they've called it, the Perrin Park precinct. Anyway, the old Toowong Bowls Club. They're not going to go ahead with that unless there is an offset, a commensurate, size, value of land that's replacing that effectively. And I reckon it's a no-brainer for the ABC site to become that space. You're obviously not going to use it for a school, but because it's not the right place, but also much better use for a park there. So I think this is clearly the solution. The state government needs to find some land to give to the council to offset the use of the park. The ABC site is the natural, it's the perfect answer to everyone's problems. But anyway, I won't hold my breath on that. Okay, probably one last question from Sally. A couple of months ago, Queensland Parliament legalised voluntary assisted dying. What do you think about this? Look, in as quickly as I can, I think it's fantastic. Obviously, any conversation about death and dying is going to be hard, and there's a lot of complexity in this issue. It's very easy for detractors to misrepresent, but I've been a supporter of voluntary assisted dying since well before I was elected. It was part of our platform for both of the elections that I went through successfully. If anything, I'm a bit sad that this law has come too late for so many people who have been advocating for this for years, who've shared their stories and who won't have access to voluntary assisted dying should they want to choose it. But it was a resounding success for this legislation. It was a conscience vote. There were 10 opposition members who voted for it, along with all but less than a handful of the government members. Amy and I obviously both supported it. So I think this is lasting change, and I think it's been very thoroughly dealt with by 2 parliamentary inquiries and the Queensland Law Reform Commission. So as far as VAD schemes go, I think it's up there with the best in the world. And according that's the view of the experts that deal with this very complex law as well. Look, I'm gonna I'm gonna go for one more quick question, just because I'm going to go over time. Comment from Facebook even. Queensland happily following WA and SA to support CCS carbon capture and storage projects, with Glencore announcing one currently pending approval. Would be great if Queensland Labor could deny this, given Gorgon LNG project is failing miserably. Oh, look, yeah, couldn't agree more. Carbon capture and storage is a total scam. It simply won't work. It can't work on the scales that it would need to do the job that it purports to do. It's simply an excuse that governments use to kind of push back the inevitable and to keep burning coal. Happily, we haven't yet heard Queensland Labor spruiking this rubbish just yet, unlike Labor in WA and unlike the LNP federally. But that hasn't, Labor just basically haven't bothered with that as part of their toolkit to keep expanding coal and gas production in Queensland. They in fact keep boasting about opening up however many 80 odd thousand hectares of Queensland to fracking since they've been elected, and boasted, you'd remember maybe during the election, they boasted about opening up 18 coal mines. They do talk a lot now, and we had this ridiculous motion in Parliament a couple of weeks ago where they were trying to apply pressure to the federal government before they picked up their net zero 2050 target. And it's this motion that says Queensland Labor supports net zero by 2050. Which we know isn't enough. And again, I'm just concerned that they're using that net zero 2050 target as a smokescreen, as a way of avoiding talking about the urgent need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions, carbon pollution now, and set really, not drastic, but strong targets for 2030. We know the science is telling us we need to be aiming for 75% emissions reduction by 2030, by the end of this decade. And then 5 years after that is when we need to get to net zero. So anyway, I'll keep banging on about this all night. But look, ultimately, there's a lot more needs to be done in this space. It's not easy, but it's absolutely clear that we need to phase out coal and gas and, look after workers throughout that transition. We can do that. If we engage with these communities in an honest conversation while we're building, to 100% clean energy, electrifying transport, and retrofitting buildings, dealing with those heavy emitting industries, there is a path through this. But governments have just got to be willing to have an honest conversation with the community about it, rather than continuing that it's hunky dory. We can just build renewables and that's the solution, when in fact, it doesn't matter. You can put renewables all you like on top of fossil fuels, and that doesn't actually address the problem. So, look, I'm going to have to wrap it up there. That's look, I'm sure I can't even see them all anymore, but I'm sure there were plenty more questions I didn't get to. So thanks again. Really appreciate everyone tuning in. If you've got a really burning question, please email the office or even, get in touch with us any way you can. We'll endeavour to respond. Now, as promised, I'll include in the comments links to how to make a submission on the Raise the Age bill and details to contact the Deputy Premier about Clive Palmer's crazy coal-fired power station. But look, I'll leave it at that. Really, really appreciate everyone jumping online. I hope that you've gotten something out of this and it wasn't just a weird hour-long ramble from some weird guy standing in his office at 6 o'clock at night. But yeah, appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of your week and I'll catch you around. Bye.